A veiled woman knocks thrice at 221B. My husband died in a locked room and I killed him. Holmes uncovers two wives, Violet, the secret bride, and Evelyn, the dead first wife who survived an avalanche. Evelyn, mad with vengeance, poisons Sir Reginald through the ceiling using a silk thread and prussic acid, then tries to frame her half-sister. Clues: a mourning card cipher, a clock that strikes 13, a mirror that lies twice. In the final confrontation, Holmes stops the 13th stroke. Evelyn is taken to Broadmoor. Violet walks free. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. Chapter 1. The Woman Who Knocked Thrice. It was one of those wretched November evenings in which London seems to dissolve into its own exhalations. The fog, thick as pea soup and yellow as sulfur, pressed against the windows of 221B Baker Street like a living thing, seeking admittance. The gas lamps in the street below struggled feebly, each haloed in a sickly aureole that served only to make the darkness beyond more impenetrable. From time to time, the muffled clop of a hansom cab or the distant cry of a newsboy penetrated the gloom. But for the most part, the world outside had withdrawn into silence. I had spent the earlier part of the day attending a lecture at the Royal Society upon the uses of iodoform in compound fractures, a subject of some interest to a medical man lately returned from Afghanistan, and had afterwards dined at my club. The combination of damp clothing, indifferent mutton, and the knowledge that my practice in Paddington was still lamentably thin had combined to render me thoroughly out of spirits. It was with a sense of profound relief that I mounted the 17 steps to our familiar sitting room, anticipating the cheerful blaze of the fire and the stimulating, if occasionally maddening, society of my friend Sherlock Holmes. I found him exactly where I expected, sunk deep in his armchair, long legs stretched towards the coals, a litter of revolver cartridges and half a dozen pistols arranged upon the table like specimens in a museum. He was testing a new theory upon the relative accuracy of various makes of service revolver, and the chemical corner of the room reeked pleasantly of burned powder. A half-consumed pipe lay cold in the ashtray. The violin, for once, rested untouched in its case. Holmes's thin, eager face was alight with that peculiar inner fire which told me he was either in the midst of a case or starving for one. "You are wet through, Watson," he observed without looking up, "and you have been standing too long upon your left leg. The old wound troubles you in this weather. Sit down, man, and warm yourself. Mrs. Hudson has left a noble sirloin in the pantry, and there is a bottle of the 76 bone which you affect." I laughed as I peeled off my sodden ulster. "You never fail, Holmes. Yes, the Jezzail bullet aches like the very devil when the glass falls. But how you knew I favored the bone? Elementary? The cork you drew last Tuesday still lies upon the sideboard with a crumb of Stilton adhering to it. A man who marries Stilton to Burgundy is not likely to change his allegiance in 6 days. I had scarcely settled myself with a pipe and a glass when the clock upon the mantel struck the half-hour after 9. At the very same instant there came 3 knocks upon the outer door below. 3 deliberate, measured knocks, neither hurried nor timid, but spaced with the precision of a funeral bell. Holmes's head came up like a hound that scents the quarry. 3 knocks, he murmured. Not the hurried double tap of a casual messenger, nor the impatient rat-tat of a creditor. 3 knocks, Watson, slow, deliberate, and unless I am much mistaken, counted aloud by the knocker. Curious. Mrs. Hudson appeared upon the landing a moment later, her good-natured face unusually grave. "If you please, sir, there is a lady to see Mr. Holmes. She would give no name, only that it is a matter of life and death. She is very heavily veiled and seems in great distress." Holmes sprang from his chair with the eager grace of a panther. "Show her up at once, Mrs. Hudson, and pray do not leave us. Your presence may reassure our visitor." The landlady hesitated. "She particularly asked that she might see you alone, sir." "Nonsense," said Holmes briskly. "Dr. Watson is discretion itself, and I have no secrets from him. Besides, the lady may require medical attention. Show her up." Mrs. Hudson vanished, and we heard the slow, uncertain tread of our visitor upon the stairs. She paused upon the landing as though gathering courage. Then the door opened, and there entered a figure which might have stepped from the pages of a sensation novel. She was tall and clad from head to foot in black, a heavy cloak of some rich silk, black gloves, black stockings, and black walking shoes of patent leather. But it was the veil that arrested attention. Thick crepe, doubled and falling from the brim of a close bonnet to below the waist, utterly concealing the face. Only the outline of the figure and the restless motion of the gloved hands betrayed that a living woman stood before us. In her left hand she carried a small portmanteau of foreign make, Russian leather, I thought, and in her right a single mourning card edged with silver. Holmes bowed with something of old-world courtesy. "Pray be seated, madam. This is my friend and colleague, Dr. Watson, in whose chronicles you already possess, I dare say, a certain anonymous celebrity. You may speak with perfect freedom." The veiled head inclined slightly in my direction. Then the stranger sank into the basket chair opposite Holmes as though her strength had suddenly deserted her. For a full minute she sat in silence, the gloved fingers working convulsively upon the handle of the portmanteau. At last a voice issued from behind the veil, low, cultured, yet strained almost to breaking point. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes, I have come to you because there is no one else in England, no one else in the world who can help me. 3 nights ago my husband was found dead in his locked study. The doctors say heart failure. The coroner has returned a verdict of death from natural causes. But I know that he was murdered, and the most terrible part of all is that the hand which struck him down was my own." The words fell into the quiet room like stones into a well. I felt the hairs rise upon my neck. Holmes alone remained perfectly composed, though I saw the keen glitter of excitement in his gray eyes. "An extraordinary statement, madam," he said quietly. "Perhaps you would do me the favor of beginning at the beginning. First, your name, if you feel you can trust us with it." A shudder passed through the black-clad figure. "My name must remain unspoken even here. You may call me Lady V, that is near enough. My husband was Sir Reginald Bromley, Baronet of Bromley House, Chelsea. Perhaps you have heard of him." Holmes inclined his head. "The name is not unknown to me. A wealthy man, something of a recluse these last years, a noted collector of Oriental porcelain. The Bromley collection of Ming is, I believe, unrivaled in private hands." "You are correct. 3 nights ago, Tuesday last, Sir Reginald retired to his study at 11 o'clock, as was his invariable custom, to work upon the catalogue of a new acquisition, a pair of dragon vases of the Suante period. He dismissed his valet at the door, locked it from within, and was seen no more until the following morning, when the butler, becoming alarmed, forced the door and found his master seated at his desk, dead. The room was locked, the windows fastened. No weapon, no trace of poison, no mark of violence. Only a faint, peculiar odor which the doctors attributed to the brandy he had been drinking. The glass stood half empty beside him. She paused, and I saw the veil tremble as she drew a deep breath. That is the story the world believes. But there is more. Much more. On the day of the funeral I found this among my husband's private papers. She opened the portmanteau and drew forth the mourning card I had noticed earlier. Laying it upon the table between us, she turned it so that we might read the inscription. Beneath the usual pious text, in loving memory, someone had written in violet ink 3 lines, V. 13, 21, 8. The mirror lies twice. Ask the clock that struck 13. Holmes fairly pounced upon the card, holding it to the lamplight and sniffing delicately at the ink. "Still fragrant," he murmured. "Russian violet from Hartman's in Wardour Street. Very distinctive. The message was written no more than a week ago. And this cipher, childishly simple to anyone familiar with the Bromley household, yet admirably obscure to the uninitiated." In less than 30 seconds he had solved it, his long fingers tracing the reference upon the flyleaf of a pocket testament he drew from a shelf. Ecclesiastes chapter 1 verse 2. "Vanity of vanities, saith the preacher, vanity of vanities, all is vanity." Your husband's favorite text, I take it. The veiled head bowed in assent. He would quote it whenever he felt himself tempted beyond endurance. "Tempted by what, madam?" asked Holmes gently. There was a long silence, then the answer came scarcely above a whisper. "By me. By the woman he married in secret 6 months ago, while his first wife, whom all the world believes dead these 5 years, still lived." Holmes leaned back in his chair, his fingertips pressed together, his eyes half closed in profound concentration. Outside, the foghorn upon the river gave its mournful cry, and somewhere in the distance a clock began to strike the hour, 10 slow, deliberate strokes. The woman who called herself Lady V had brought us a case which promised to be as dark and tangled as any in our long association. And somewhere in the shrouded streets of London a clock, I reflected with a shiver, was preparing to strike 13. The game, as my friend Sherlock Holmes was wont to say, was afoot. Chapter 2. The Cipher on the Mourning Card. Sherlock Holmes remained motionless for perhaps 10 seconds after Lady V's confession, the firelight flickering upon the sharp profile which had become as familiar to me as my own reflection. Then he rose with that sudden feline energy which always startled me, crossed to the window and stood looking down into the streaming emptiness of Baker Street. "6 months a bigamous wife," he said at last, half to himself, "and 5 years a husband who believed his first wife safely buried beneath a Swiss avalanche. Remarkable. And now the baronet is dead, apparently of heart failure, in a locked room, and you, madam, believe yourself guilty of his murder. Pray continue." Lady V drew the heavy veil a little aside, not enough to reveal her features, but sufficient for us to see the glint of tears upon her lashes. "I do not believe Mr. Holmes, I know. On the night he died, I was in the house. I had come to him secretly, as I had done many times before, by the little postern gate that opens upon the river embankment. We quarreled bitterly. I accused him of cowardice in not acknowledging me openly. He swore that he would do so as soon as the legal difficulties were resolved. Then he poured himself a glass of brandy from the decanter he always kept upon the study table. I left him alive at 11:45, locking the study door behind me at his express command so that the servants should not discover me. When they broke in the next morning, he was dead, seated at his desk exactly as I had left him, the glass still half full. Who else could have poisoned him but I?" Holmes wheeled round, his eyes gleaming. "Poisoned? Yet the doctors found no trace. None that they recognized. Reginald suffered from angina pectoris. The symptoms are almost identical. A few drops of a rare essence, colorless, almost odorless when mixed with brandy. There are substances known to science." "Indeed there are," said Holmes dryly. "And you possess such a substance?" She hesitated, then opened the Russian portmanteau and drew forth a tiny crystal phial, no larger than my little finger, stoppered with red wax. It was quite empty. "I bought it in Vienna last spring from an old apothecary in the Josefstadt. He called it Oleum amygdalae amare concentratum, concentrated oil of bitter almonds. A single drop, he told me, would stop the strongest heart within minutes. I purchased it in a moment of madness, thinking that if Reginald ever abandoned me, I should end my own life. Instead, she could not continue. Holmes took the file delicately between thumb and forefinger, held it to the light and sniffed. Prussic acid, purified and concentrated. Extremely volatile, the merest trace remains. You are fortunate the police did not search your luggage, madam. He laid the file upon the table and returned to the mourning card. And this charming communication? When did you receive it? Yesterday morning. It was pushed beneath the door of my hotel room in Bloomsbury. There was no superscription, no footmark in the corridor, nothing. Holmes studied the card again, then suddenly laughed, a short, excited sound. Watson, do you not see? The whole thing is a deliberate torment. The cipher is not intended for the police, it is intended for her. Someone wishes Lady V to believe herself guilty, to drive her to despair or confession. The reference to Ecclesiastes' vanity of vanities was Sir Reginald's private reproach to himself whenever he yielded to passion. The murderer knows that. The mirror lies twice, and the clock that struck 13 are further private illusions. This is no ordinary crime, but a revenge as elaborate as any in fiction. He began pacing the room in great excitement, his dressing gown flapping like the wings of some ungainly bird. Consider the sequence. First, a locked room mystery apparently insoluble. Second, the bigamous wife provided with motive, opportunity, and the very poison required. Third, an anonymous message designed to goad her into self-accusation. Someone, my dear Lady V, wishes you to hang for a murder you did not commit. The veiled figure swayed as though struck. Then, I am innocent? As innocent as I am at present, said Holmes, though the distinction may be temporary unless we act swiftly. Tell me, has any other person a key to the study? Only Reginald himself and old Greaves the butler, who has been with the family 40 years. And the windows? They were fastened on the inside. The room is on the first floor, overlooking the river. Holmes rubbed his hands together. Excellent. Watson, we shall require your service revolver and your strongest walking boots. Tomorrow morning we visit Bromley House. Lady V, you will remain here tonight under Mrs. Hudson's care. It is the safest place in London. And now, madam, one final question. The First Lady Bromley who perished in the Alps, was she by chance your cousin or very like you in face and figure? Lady V started violently. She was my half-sister. We were often mistaken for each other as girls. Holmes's smile was positively wolfish. Then I think we begin to see daylight through the fog. Go now and rest. Tomorrow we shall beard the dragon in its den. As the door closed behind our extraordinary client, Holmes turned to me with shining eyes. Come, Watson. The game is afoot, and a very pretty game indeed. A locked room, a poisoned baronet, 2 wives who might be twins, and a cipher that quotes Ecclesiastes. What more could a reasonable man desire? Proof, I said stoutly. That, my dear fellow, is what we shall find in Chelsea tomorrow, among the Ming porcelain and the smell of bitter almonds. Outside, the fog pressed thicker than ever against the window panes, and somewhere in the shrouded city a clock struck 11, slow, deliberate, and unless my ears deceived me, just a fraction late, as though preparing itself for the day when it would strike 13. Chapter 3. The house that watched itself. The morning broke raw and sullen, the fog thinned to a dirty haze that clung to the river like a mourning veil. Holmes and I breakfasted early, he upon coffee and excitement, I upon eggs and apprehension, then took a 4-wheeler to Chelsea. Lady V had been left in Mrs. Hudson's capable hands with strict instructions to admit no one, not even the Archbishop of Canterbury. Bromley House stood at the end of a short cul-de-sac that sloped towards the Thames, a tall, narrow mansion of blackened London brick, its windows tall and disapproving. Ivy clung to the walls in ragged patches as though the house itself were trying to hide its face. A single gas lamp still burned upon the corner, though it was past 9 o'clock, and the river behind the house breathed cold mist through the iron railings. Old Greaves opened the door before we had time to knock. He was a stooped, parchment-skinned relic with watery eyes and the deliberate movements of extreme age. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, Madam telegraphed that you would come. The study remains exactly as it was left, sir, save that the master has been removed." His voice cracked on the last word. 40 years of service, I reflected, and now the house was empty of its center. Holmes wasted no ceremony. "Greaves, on the night Sir Reginald died, did you hear anything unusual after midnight?" The butler shook his head slowly. "Nothing, sir. I sleep at the back of the house and I am somewhat deaf. But the footman, Jarvis, swears he heard the study clock strike 13 just before 1. He thought himself dreaming and turned over. Holmes's eyes flashed. 13, excellent. And the study door, was it locked when you broke it open?" "Locked and bolted from within, sir. We had to use the jemmy from the stables." Holmes gave me a significant glance and bounded up the stairs 2 at a time. I followed more sedately, revolver heavy in my overcoat pocket. The study was a long, somber apartment on the first floor, paneled in dark oak and lined with glass-fronted cabinets containing the famous Bromley porcelain. Dragons and phoenixes in imperial yellow, delicate celadon bowls, moon-white Kuan Yin figures that seemed to watch us with tranquil malice. The river windows were still shuttered, only a single jet of gas burned above the mantel, hissing softly. Sir Reginald's desk stood in the center of the Turkey carpet, a massive partner's desk of mahogany. Upon it lay an open catalogue, a magnifying loupe, and the 2 dragon vases, magnificent pieces, crimson and turquoise, coiled about with 5-clawed imperial dragons. Beside the vases stood the crystal brandy decanter, now sealed with red tape by the police, and a single heavy glass containing a finger's breadth of amber liquid and a faint white sediment. Holmes knelt at once beside the door. "Observe, Watson, the lock is a Brahma, the bolt a Chubb, both excellent. No scratches upon the keyhole, no wax impression. Yet look here." He pointed to the carpet just inside the threshold. "The pile has been disturbed in a semicircle, as though the door was opened wide and then closed again after something was dragged across it." He moved to the windows. Each was fastened by a patent sash lock. The catches were stiff with disuse and the paint around them undisturbed. "Impossible from outside," I said. "Apparently," replied Holmes, but his tone suggested the opposite. He then did a curious thing. He climbed upon the desk, careful not to disturb the vases, and stood upright, head almost touching the ornate plaster ceiling rose directly above. The rose was the elaborate affair of acanthus leaves and scrolling foliage surrounding a central boss the size of a soup plate. "Give me your pencil, Watson." I handed it up. With the eraser end, he tapped the boss gently. It gave forth a hollow sound. "Ah, recently repaired. See the faint circular join no wider than a sixpence? Someone has cut a neat plug from the plaster, then replaced it with fresh material. The work is only a week old. The surface is still slightly damp." He sprang down, eyes blazing. "Watson, we are standing beneath the murder method itself. The ceiling is the door by which death entered the room." At that moment, a slight sound reached us from the corridor, the soft creak of a floorboard. Holmes whirled like a dancer, but it was only Greaves bringing a tray of coffee. The old man's hands shook so violently that the cups rattled. "Begging your pardon, sir, but there's a lady below asking for Dr. Watson, says it's urgent." I looked at Holmes in surprise. "A lady? Did she give a name?" "She is veiled, sir. Very heavily veiled." Holmes's expression became grim. "Show her up, Greaves, but remain within call." A moment later, the door opened and a second black-clad figure entered, taller than Lady V, moving with a different grace. The veil was even thicker if that were possible, and a faint but unmistakable scent of Russian violet ink clung to her gloves. "Dr. Watson," said a voice I almost recognized, "I have come to warn you. Leave this house at once. Some truths are better left buried with the dead." Holmes stepped forward swiftly. "Madam, you trespass upon dangerous ground. Remove that veil." For answer, the stranger laughed softly and backed towards the door. "Ask the clock that struck 13, Mr. Holmes. Ask the mirror that lies twice. Some games are played for higher stakes than you know." She was gone before we could stop her, the scent of violets lingering like a mocking ghost. Holmes stood motionless, every nerve taut. "Watson," he said at last, "we are watched by more eyes than we thought. That was not our client. That was the woman who wrote the mourning card." He looked up once more at the plaster rose above the desk, and I saw his jaw set with that familiar bulldog expression. "Somewhere in this house," he said quietly, "there is an attic directly above us. And in that attic, unless I am very much mistaken, we shall find the other end of the thread that strangled Sir Reginald Bromley." Outside, the river fog thickened again, and the old house seemed to settle deeper into itself, as though it had been waiting a long time for someone to understand its secret. Chapter 4. Footprints in Wet Plaster. We left the study in a fever of impatience and mounted the narrow servants' staircase that spiraled upward from the back corridor. Holmes went first, moving with the silent swiftness of a Red Indian on the trail. I followed, revolver in hand, heart thumping against my ribs. The house was unnaturally still. Even Greaves's shuffling footsteps had faded away below. 2 flights up, we reached the attic story, a long, low passage lit only by a single skylight filmed with soot. Dust lay thick upon the boards, undisturbed for years save for one narrow path of recent prints leading to a baize-covered door at the far end. Holmes knelt, candle in hand. "Observe, Watson. A woman's shoe, small, pointed Louis heel, fashionable yet much worn at the outer edge. The left heel presses deeper. Our visitor favors her right leg when tired. And here," he brushed away dust with his glove, "a second set, almost obliterated. A man's boot, narrow, continental cut, size 8. The two walked together within the last fortnight, yet took pains to disguise the fact." Curious. He rose and tried the baize door. It opened without a sound. The attic beyond was a single vast chamber running the full length of the house. A chaos of discarded furniture, tea chests, and Holland-covered pictures met the eye. But in the center, directly above the study ceiling rose, a clear space had been swept. In its midst stood a low painter's easel, a deal table littered with tubes of oil color, and a large Venetian mirror in a tarnished gilt frame propped against a trunk. Holmes pounced upon the mirror. "Watson, the second part of the cipher. The mirror lies twice. Observe. The glass is subtly convex. Placed at the correct angle, it will throw a perfect reflection of the ceiling below through a small aperture." He lay flat upon the dusty floor and pressed his eye to a spot where 2 boards had been neatly sawn and replaced. Beneath, through a circular hole no larger than a crown piece, the study ceiling rose was visible as though on a stage. "Beautifully contrived," he murmured. "The murderer lay here, watched through the hole, and when Sir Reginald raised his glass, drip death descended upon a silken thread. The thread was then withdrawn, the plug of plaster replaced and smoothed over from above with a palette knife. The faint smell of wet plaster which the police attributed to recent repairs was in fact the murderer's signature. I stared at the neat little hole, a cold shiver traversing my spine. But the poison! How was it delivered so exactly? Holmes sprang up and crossed to the table. Upon it lay a child's fishing rod of bamboo, the line replaced by fine black silk, and at the end a tiny silver spoon no larger than a thimble. Prussic acid is heavier than brandy. A single drop placed in the spoon lowered until it touches the liquid in the glass. Surface tension does the rest. The thread is drawn up, the spoon wiped upon a rag soaked in spirits of wine. Observe the faint almond odor still clinging to this cloth, and the evidence vanishes. Childishly simple, yet diabolically ingenious. He turned to the easel. Upon it rested a half-finished portrait in oils. A woman in mourning, heavily veiled, the face only suggested beneath the lace. The brushwork was bold, almost masculine, yet the likeness to our client unmistakable. "Signed E.B.," I read aloud. "Evelyn Bromley, the first Lady Bromley." Holmes nodded grimly. "The presumed corpse returns as Nemesis. She survived the avalanche, Watson. Some alpine shepherd found her half-frozen and nursed her back to life. For 5 years she has waited, watched, planned. Discovering the bigamous marriage, she determined not only to kill her faithless husband but to hang the usurper in his place. Every detail, the mourning card, the cipher, the impersonation of Lady V, was designed to drive our client to confession or suicide. At that moment, a board creaked behind us. We whirled to confront old Greaves, pale as a corpse, a heavy poker in his trembling hand. "I heard voices," he quavered. "Thought there were burglars. Sir Reginald's vases are worth a fortune." Holmes relieved him of the poker with gentle firmness. "No burglars, Greaves, only ghosts. Tell me, did Lady Bromley, the first Lady Bromley, ever paint?" The old man's eyes widened. "Miss Evelyn was a rare artist, sir. Painted portraits what looked like photographs. After the avalanche, Sir Reginald locked up her studio and would let no one enter. Said it was too painful. And yet someone has been here very recently," Holmes said, indicating the fresh footprints. "Greaves, have you seen a tall woman in black visiting the house these past weeks? Or a man in a military cape with a foreign accent?" The butler hesitated, then nodded slowly. "There was a gentleman, called himself Captain Ventress. Said he was a friend of the master's from India. Came several times after dark. And once, yes, a veiled lady. I thought it was the master's fancy woman begging your pardon and turned a blind eye. Sir Reginald was not himself these last months." Holmes's smile was thin and dangerous. "Captain Geoffrey Ventress was killed at Maiwand, Greaves. I read the casualty lists myself. Your visitor was someone wearing a dead man's name and very possibly his boots." He strode to the dormer window that overlooked the river. The fog was lifting a little. One could just discern the gray sweep of the Thames and the black shapes of wherries gliding past. "See here, Watson. The flower bed directly beneath the study window. Recently dug for winter bulbs, yet the earth is disturbed in 2 distinct patches. Someone entered or left by that route, and not lightly. We descended at once to the garden. The bed was a rectangle of raw soil, the bulbs already planted." Holmes dropped to his knees like a terrier. Woman's shoe again, small, fashionable, left heel deeper. And beside it, yes, the man's narrow boot. But look, the woman's prints lead toward the river wall, the man's return in the opposite direction as though he handed her down and then climbed back alone. And here, he scraped away a clod of earth, a splash of wet plaster fallen from above when the ceiling plug was replaced in haste. He stood up, brushing soil from his hands, his eyes alight with that fierce joy which I knew meant the net was closing. "Tomorrow, Watson, we shall set a little trap of our own. Tonight I require the Ordnance Survey map of Chelsea, a tide table, and the loan of Lestrade's plainclothesmen. The veiled suspect believes herself invisible, but every veil has 2 sides, and we have just turned ours the right way out." As we returned through the house, the gas jet in the study below flared suddenly, though no hand had touched it, and for an instant the shadow of the great dragon vase upon the wall seemed to writhe like a living thing. Bromley House was watching us still, and somewhere in its darkened heart a clock ticked patiently toward the 13th stroke. Chapter 5. The Scent of Bitter Almonds. We returned to Baker Street in a four-wheeler that smelled of damp straw and wet horse. Holmes was silent the entire journey, his chin sunk upon his breast, eyes half closed. Yet I knew from the occasional quiver of his nostrils that his mind was racing like a bloodhound on a hot trail. As soon as we reached our rooms, he flung himself into the chemical corner, cleared the table with one sweep of his arm, and began arranging a dozen glass phials, a spirit lamp, and the small silver spoon from the attic. "Watson, be so good as to fetch the brandy decanter from the Tantalus. We must verify the exact concentration required." I stared at him in horror. "Holmes, you are not proposing to—" "Only upon a laboratory rat, my dear fellow. I purchased a pair this morning from the medical student in Montague Street. Science must be served." The experiment was brief and conclusive. A single drop of the concentrated prussic acid, delivered by the silk thread into a wine glass of brandy, vanished without trace within 30 seconds, leaving only the faintest aroma of bitter almonds that faded almost as quickly. The rat expired instantly, its tiny heart stilled in mid-beat. Holmes laid the creature gently aside. "Death in 4 to 6 minutes for a man of Sir Reginald's constitution," he said. "The faint sediment noted by the police was merely the natural tartar of the brandy. The poison itself was gone before the valet even raised the alarm. A perfect crime, had it not been for the vanity of the criminal." He washed his hands, then lit his oldest briar and began pacing. "Now let us reconstruct the night of the murder. Sir Reginald retires to his study at 11. At 11:45 he makes the final entry in his diary, 11:45 V, meaning I suggest the arrival of our client, Lady V. They quarrel. She departs by the river postern at 11:45, leaving him alive and agitated. He pours himself a stiff brandy to steady his nerves. Above him in the attic, the murderess, Evelyn Bromley, the first wife, lies prone, eye to the peephole. She sees the glass raised. Down comes the spoon on its silken thread, 1 drop, perhaps 2 for safety. The thread is withdrawn, the spoon wiped, the plaster plug replaced. By the time the clock strikes midnight, Sir Reginald is already dead, slumped forward upon his catalogue. But the clock must strike 13. The mechanism had been tampered with weeks earlier, merely a question of loosening the escapement screw so that the hammer would fall once extra on the hour. A signal to any accomplice waiting below that the deed was done. And there was an accomplice, Watson. The man in the narrow boots, our soi-disant Captain Ventris. He hands the murderess down from the study window, hence the deeper impression of her left heel as she descends, assists her to a waiting boat on the river, then climbs back, smooths the plaster from inside the study, locks the door behind him with a duplicate key, and departs by the main staircase, trusting Greaves's deafness to cover his exit. I poured myself a small whiskey to steady my nerves. But why the elaborate charade of the mourning card and the cipher? Why not simply let the bigamous wife hang? Holmes smiled grimly. Because Evelyn Bromley is an artist, Watson, and artists crave an audience. She wished her rival not merely to die, but to suffer, to know herself hunted, to see the shadow of the gallows lengthening day by day. The card was a love letter of hatred, signed with Sir Reginald's own favorite text. Vanity of vanities. All is vanity. She, the discarded wife, would prove herself the only true Lady Bromley by destroying the usurper with the very evidence that proved her own existence. He stopped pacing and stood before the fire, hands clasped behind his back. Yet she has made one fatal mistake. She believes herself invisible behind her veil, but a veil is only crepe, and crepe tears. Tonight we shall tear it. He crossed to the writing desk and dashed off 3 telegrams. The first to Lestrade. Hold 3 plainclothesmen ready at the yard after dark. Matter urgent. S.H. The second to Lady V at Baker Street. Remain indoors until you hear from me. Trust no one, not even a messenger wearing my name. S.H. The third to the Chelsea Division Police Surgeon. Request analysis of plaster scrapings from Bromley House ceiling rows. Suspect cyanide crystals. Urgent. S.H. He rang for the page boy, handed over the telegrams with a half-crown, then turned to me with that boyish smile which always meant mischief. And now, Watson, a small experiment in practical psychology. We shall set a mousetrap baited with the one thing our murderess cannot resist, her own reflection. From a drawer he produced a black silk veil identical to those worn by both women, and a lady's mourning bonnet. Mrs. Hudson's niece is a milliner in the Brompton Road. She supplied these this afternoon. You, my dear fellow, have the advantage of a military mustache which may be temporarily sacrificed. With a little padding and a bustle, you will make a most convincing widow. I stared at him aghast. Holmes, you cannot be serious. Never more so. At 10 o'clock tonight, you will present yourself at the gates of Bromley House heavily veiled, carrying a portmanteau containing the dragon vases. Greaves will admit you without question, believing you to be Lady V come to collect her property. Once inside the study, you will seat yourself at the desk, pour a glass of brandy from a fresh decanter I shall provide, and raise it slowly to your lips. The murderess, watching from the attic, will be unable to resist the temptation to complete her work. The moment the silk thread appears through the ceiling rows, Lestrade's men, concealed in the garden, will rush the attic. The game will be ours. And if she suspects the ruse? Then you will have a loaded revolver in your muff and a former soldier of the 66th Foot beneath the skirt. I think you may hold your own against a lady painter, however vengeful. I laughed in spite of myself. Very well, Holmes. For the sake of the science of deduction, I consent to become the most heavily veiled widow in London. He clapped me on the shoulder. Spoken like a true comrade. And now let us dine, upon oysters and a bottle of Sauterne, for a man about to impersonate a murderess's victim should at least do so upon a full stomach. Outside, the fog was rolling in again from the river, thicker than ever, wrapping London in its yellow shroud. Somewhere in its depths a clock prepared to strike the quarter, and I could have sworn that for a single chilling instant, one of the strokes sounded almost, like a 13th. Chapter 6. A Waltz in a Minor Key. The trap was baited, but the mouse refused to nibble. At 9 o'clock that evening, I stood in our sitting room, swathed in black silk and crepe, feeling the perfect fool. A bustle the size of a regimental bass drum had been strapped beneath my petticoats. A veil thick enough to stop a Martini Henry bullet hung from a mourning bonnet, and in the reticule dangling from my gloved wrist lay my old service revolver. Holmes, in evening dress and Inverness, surveyed me with ill-concealed amusement. You are the very picture of widowed desolation, Watson. One more touch. He dabbed a trace of Russian violet ink upon my gloves, and the most suspicious murderess in London will be convinced. A growler took us to the Embankment. Holmes dropped me at the corner of Tite Street with final instructions whispered through the trapdoor. Remember, move slowly, limp a little on the left foot, count every third step aloud under your breath. She will be listening. Lestrade has 2 men in the garden and 1 in the coal cellar. At the first flicker of silk through the ceiling rows, scream like a banshee. I shall be directly beneath the study window with a bull's-eye lantern. Good luck, my dear doctor. I descended, skirts rustling, and made my way along the river wall to the iron gate of Bromley House. The fog was now so dense that the gas lamps were mere orange smudges. I could hear the lap of the tide against the embankment and the muffled shout of a bargee somewhere out in the stream. Old Greaves admitted me without surprise. "I was told to expect you, ma'am. The master's vases are crated in the study. Mind the step. The fog do make everything treacherous." I murmured acknowledgment in the husky contralto Holmes had drilled into me and swept up the staircase, counting softly. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3, like a funeral march. The study was exactly as we had left it, save that the dragon vases now stood in a wooden crate lined with straw. A fresh decanter of brandy and a single glass had been placed upon the desk by Holmes's arrangement. The room was lit only by the low gas jet above the mantel. The great plaster rose above me looked like a blind white eye in the gloom. I seated myself, arranged my skirts, poured 2 fingers of brandy, and began the most nerve-wracking performance of my life. Slowly I raised the glass, paused, lowered it, raised it again, all the while murmuring broken endearments to the memory of the dead man. Minutes passed. Nothing. No silken thread, no faint scrape of plaster. Only the ticking of the ormolu clock on the mantel and the distant moan of a foghorn. I was beginning to fear the bird had flown when the clock whirred, preparatory to striking 10, and gave forth not 10 strokes but 11. The escapement had been tampered with again. Someone wished me to know the house was still awake. At the 11th stroke, the gas jet flared, dimmed, and went out altogether. Darkness swallowed the room. I rose, revolver half drawn, when a gloved hand touched my shoulder from behind. "Peace, Doctor," whispered Holmes's voice in my ear. "Our quarry is more subtle than we thought. She will not strike tonight. Come." He struck a vesta. By its flare I saw that the ceiling rose was undisturbed, but upon the blotter lay a fresh mourning card, the ink still wet. "The waltz is not yet over. Meet me where the music plays." E. Holmes's eyes glittered. "St. James's Hall tomorrow night, Strauss concert. She challenges us to a duel in public, Watson. We shall accept, with pleasure." The following evening found us in the crush of the promenade at St. James's Hall. The great chandelier blazed. The orchestra was tuning for the Künstlerleben waltz. Fashionable London eddied around us. Silk hats, diamonds, the scent of hothouse flowers and Russian leather. Holmes, elegant in white tie, scanned the throng with hawk-like intensity. She will come veiled, of course, but watch for the limp, the slight favoring of the right leg. There, in the shadow of a marble pillar, stood a tall woman in black, veiled to the ground, one gloved hand resting upon the balustrade. Beside her, a man in faultless evening dress, military mustache, the ribbon of the Afghanistan medal in his buttonhole. I felt the blood drain from my face. "Holmes, that officer is Captain Geoffrey Ventris, but Ventris died at Maiwand. I saw the grave myself." "Exactly," said Holmes between clenched teeth. "A dead man walks tonight, and he is waltzing with our murderess." The orchestra struck up. Couples swirled onto the floor. The veiled woman extended her hand. The dead captain bowed and led her into the dance. As they turned beneath the chandelier, the veil lifted for an instant, revealing a pale, beautiful face convulsed with triumph and despair. Holmes gripped my arm so hard that I almost cried out. 2 veiled women, Watson. Identical height, identical carriage. The one who danced is the murderess. The one who remained at Baker Street is our client. But which is which now? The waltz gathered speed. The black gown billowed like a storm cloud. The captain's scarlet tunic flashed. Around and around they spun, closer and closer to where we stood. At the final crescendo, the woman threw back her veil entirely and stared straight into Holmes's eyes, defiant, mocking, magnificent. Then the music stopped. Applause thundered. In that instant, captain and widow melted into the crowd and were gone. Holmes stood like a statue, the color drained from his cheeks. "Checkmate, for the moment," he said at last. "She has shown us her face and dared us to take her. But a waltz has 3 movements, Watson, and the 3rd is yet to come." Outside, the fog had lifted for the first time in days. The stars burned cold and bright above Piccadilly, and somewhere in the distance a clock began to strike the half-hour. Clear, deliberate, and exactly on time. But I knew that somewhere else in London another clock was waiting, patient and terrible for the hour when it would strike 13 once more. Chapter 7. The Veiled Suspect. We returned to Baker Street through streets washed clean by a cold wind that had driven the last of the fog back to the river. Holmes was silent in the hansom, his profile sharp against the passing lamps. But I could feel the electric tension in him, the hunter who has seen the tiger and knows the final beat is near. Mrs. Hudson met us at the door, her face white. "Thank heaven you're back, sir. The Lady V, she's in a terrible state. Came rushing down an hour ago saying someone had been in her room. Left a note under the pillow. I've given her brandy and put her to bed, but she keeps crying that she's lost, that there are 2 of her now." Holmes bounded up the stairs 3 at a time. I followed more slowly, revolver ready. Our client lay upon the sofa in the sitting room, veil thrown back, face ravaged by tears. Yet even in distress, the beauty was unmistakable. High cheekbones, a mouth made for tragedy, and eyes of that curious violet gray which I had seen once before, beneath the chandelier at St. James's Hall. Holmes knelt beside her. "Madam, compose yourself. You are safe here. Show me the note." With shaking fingers, she handed him a single sheet of heavy mourning paper. The message was written in the same violet ink. "You danced well, little sister. But the music stops at 13. Tonight the mirror will tell the truth." E. Holmes read it aloud, then crushed the paper in his fist. "She taunts us with proximity. She was here, Watson, here in Baker Street, while we watched her waltz with a dead man in Piccadilly." He rang the bell violently. When Mrs. Hudson appeared, he fired questions like bullets. "Did anyone call while we were absent? A woman in black? A man in evening dress?" "No one, sir. Only the butcher's boy and young Billy the page came for the boots." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Billy? Describe him." Mrs. Hudson hesitated. "Why, just the usual lad. Cap pulled low, scarf up to his nose because of the cold. Said he had a message from Mr. Lestrade, handed me a note for the doctor, then took the boots to be sold." I felt the blood freeze in my veins. "Holmes, that note! I never received any note from Lestrade." We tore downstairs. Mrs. Hudson's boot box by the area door was empty. Every pair of my shoes, and more significantly the pair of narrow, pointed evening pumps I had worn disguised as Lady V, had vanished. Holmes laughed, a short, savage bark. "Brilliant. She has stolen the very shoes that left prints in the attic dust and the flower bed. She means to plant them where the police will find them, upon our client. The net closes from both sides." He turned back to Lady V. "Tell me, quickly, your Christian name." "Violet," she whispered. "Violet Mary St. Aubyn. My half-sister was Evelyn Rose. We were born 11 months apart. People said we might have been twins." Holmes nodded as though a final piece had clicked into place. "Violet and Evelyn, purple and the rose, and the ink is Russian violet. The symbolism delights her. Now listen carefully. Tonight you will do exactly as I say. You will put on the black gown and veil that hang in Mrs. Hudson's wardrobe. You will walk with Dr. Watson to the corner of Marylebone Road, where a cab will be waiting. You will then drive to Scotland Yard and place yourself under Inspector Lestrade's protection until I come. You are no longer safe here." She clutched his hand. And you, Mr. Holmes, what will you do? I, he said grimly, shall go to a house in Chelsea and wait for a clock to strike 13. Midnight found Holmes and me once more in the darkened study of Bromley House. Lestrade and 2 constables waited in the garden. A third lurked in the attic. Every lamp was extinguished. Only the dying fire in the grate gave a faint red glow. The ormolu clock upon the mantel stood at 5 minutes to 12. Holmes had placed the Venetian mirror upon the desk, angled so that the ceiling rose was reflected perfectly. A fresh glass of brandy, untouched, stood beside it. She will come, he whispered. She must. The stage is set for the final tableau. She wishes to see her rival drink from the poisoned cup while she herself stands revealed as the true Lady Bromley. The minutes crawled. The house creaked and settled around us like an old ship. At 1 minute to 12, the clock began to whir. 12 slow strokes, and then, unmistakably, a 13th. At the same instant, the gas jet flared into life of its own accord, and the door from the servant's stair opened without a sound. A woman entered, tall, veiled, gliding with the unnatural grace I had seen on the dance floor. In her right hand she carried my stolen evening pumps. In her left a tiny silver spoon on a length of black silk thread. She moved straight to the desk, laid the shoes carefully beside the brandy glass, and only then raised her veil. The face beneath was the twin of our client's, older, harder, marked with the white line of an old scar across the left temple. But the same violet-gray eyes blazed with a madness that was almost majesty. "Vanity of vanities," she said softly. "Did you truly think you could steal my life and my name, little sister? Tonight the world will know which of us is the true Violet Bromley." She raised the silver spoon above the reflected ceiling rose, poised to lower death for the second time. Holmes stepped from the shadows. "The true Lady Bromley, madam, died 5 years ago in an Alpine avalanche. You are Evelyn Rose St. Aubyn, widow, murderess, and forger of death certificates. Drop the spoon." For a moment she stood frozen, the spoon trembling above the glass. Then she laughed, a dreadful, exultant sound, and flung back her cloak. Beneath it she wore the scarlet tunic of a captain in the 66th foot, the medals gleaming. The transformation was ghastly. "Captain Ventris and Lady Bromley in one," she cried. "I am both the betrayed wife and the dead hero. I am the perfect revenge." She lunged for the brandy glass, clearly intending to drink and die defiant. Holmes was faster. His stick caught her wrist. The spoon flew across the room and shattered against a Ming vase. Lestrade and his men burst in. As the handcuffs clicked upon her wrists, Evelyn Bromley looked at Holmes with something almost like admiration. "You are clever, Mr. Holmes, almost clever enough. But tell me, how did you know it was I who danced and not my pretty little half-sister?" Holmes picked up the silver spoon's broken handle. "Because, madam, the real Violet limps with her left foot when tired. You favored the right. The mirror did indeed lie twice, once in the attic and once upon the dance floor." Outside, the first pale streak of dawn touched the river. The clock upon the mantel gave a tired sigh and fell silent. It would never strike 13 again. Chapter 8. The Mirror Lies Twice. Evelyn Bromley stood between 2 constables in the center of the study, the scarlet tunic hanging strangely upon her tall frame, the veil now thrown back like a battle flag. The first gray light of morning crept through the shutters and fell across her face, beautiful still but ravaged by 5 years of hatred and alpine frost. The scar at her temple, earned when tons of snow had hurled her against the rocks, gleamed white against the pallor. Lestrade was almost incoherent with triumph. "Mr. Holmes, this is the queerest go I ever. Dressing as a man, poisoning her own husband, trying to hang her own sister. The Yard will talk of nothing else for a 12-month. Holmes waved him to silence. He was examining the shattered silver spoon with the air of a man who has found the keystone of an arch. Queer, Lestrade? No, perfectly logical once one grasps the central fact. Evelyn Bromley did not merely wish to kill. She wished to annihilate. To prove that she alone was the true wife, the true woman, the true genius. Murder was only the overture. He turned to the prisoner. "Tell me, madam, how long had you worn the dead captain's uniform?" A ghost of the old mocking smile touched her lips. "Since my wand. Geoffrey Ventris was my lover before he ever marched with the 66th. When the news came that he had fallen, I took his spare tunic from the regimental tailor in Peshawar. I swore I would wear it one day in London, and that every man who had ever slighted me should see me in it. Fate was kind. It gave me a worthier revenge. I felt the old soldier's anger rise in me. You dishonor a brave man's memory by dressing his corpse's clothes." She looked at me with pity. "Brave men die, doctor. It is the living who must finish their work." Holmes had moved to the great Venetian mirror we had brought down from the attic. He tilted it until the ceiling rose was again perfectly reflected. "Observe, gentlemen. The convexity is slight, barely 1/4 of an inch across the diameter, yet sufficient to magnify the aperture above by a factor of 3. From the attic floor, the murderer could see not only the glass but the expression on Sir Reginald's face as he drank. A nice artistic touch. He tapped the plaster boss with his stick. A small disc, no larger than a florin, fell out with a puff of white dust. Inside the cavity lay a tiny crystal phial, empty, and a scrap of silk thread. Lestrade pounced upon them with a crow of delight. Evidence at last. Cyanide crystals still clinging to the glass, and the thread matches the piece we found knotted round the spoon. Evelyn Bromley watched him with contempt. "You will find plenty of evidence, Inspector. I left it for you. The boots in the coal cellar, the mourning cards in the attic, the forged Swiss death certificate in the safe. I wanted the world to know how completely I had won. After they hanged my pretty little half-sister, of course." Holmes regarded her steadily. "And the clock that struck 13. A simple matter. I filed the escapement screw weeks earlier. On the night of the murder, I tightened it again from the attic, using a watchmaker's turnscrew through the same hole. The extra stroke was my signal to myself that justice had been done." She laughed softly, and the sound chilled the room. "Vanity of vanities, Mr. Holmes." Reginald quoted Ecclesiastes whenever he yielded to Violet. "I merely gave him the vanity he craved, eternal silence." Lestrade motioned to his men. "Enough chatter. Evelyn Rose St. Aubin, I arrest you for the willful murder of Sir Reginald Bromley." She drew herself up, and for a moment the scarlet tunic made her look like some tragic figure from grand opera. "Lady Bromley," she corrected quietly. "I shall always be Lady Bromley. The other was only a shadow." As they led her away, Holmes detained Lestrade for a final word. "Treat her gently, Inspector. Madness has its own dignity, and she has worn it like a crown." When the door closed behind them, the study seemed suddenly larger, colder, as though the house itself had exhaled a long-held breath. I turned to Holmes. "But how did she survive the avalanche? The Swiss authorities certified her death." He was already at the safe, twirling the combination with practiced fingers. "Certified too hastily. Alpine guides are sometimes accommodating when English gold is offered." "Ah!" The heavy door swung open. Inside lay bundles of share certificates, a jewel case, and a thick packet of papers tied with faded ribbon. Holmes drew out a death certificate, genuine Swiss paper, official seals. But across the bottom someone had scrawled in red ink, "Cancelled. Patient recovered." Beneath it was a second document, a marriage certificate dated 1890 Geneva, uniting Reginald Bromley to Evelyn Rose St. Aubin, and beneath that, Another, 1895, a quiet ceremony in a Chelsea registry office. Reginald Bromley to Violet Mary St. Aubyn. Holmes closed the safe gently. 2 wives, 2 certificates, 1 grave that was never occupied. Sir Reginald's vanity was indeed monumental. He believed he could keep both sisters in separate compartments of his life, like specimens in his porcelain cabinets. He crossed to the window and threw open the shutters. The dawn was now full and the Thames lay silver below us. Come, Watson. Let us leave this house of mirrors and take the good news to the true Lady Bromley. She has spent 5 years as a bigamist's secret. Today she begins life as a free woman. As we stepped into the fresh morning air, I glanced back once. The great dragon vases upon the desk caught the first rays of sun and seemed to writhe in their crimson and turquoise coils, as though even in porcelain they protested the unraveling of their master's fate. Holmes followed my gaze. Dragons guard treasure, Watson, but they are powerless against truth. The mirror has lied twice, once when it showed Evelyn her rival's reflection as her own, and once when it convinced Sir Reginald that he could possess 2 lives without paying the reckoning. He pulled his ulster close against the dawn chill. And now, my dear fellow, breakfast. I have a sudden craving for Mrs. Hudson's deviled kidneys and a great deal of very hot coffee. Solving the problems of the living is hungry work. Behind us, Bromley House settled into silence, its windows no longer watching, its clock forever stilled. The 13th stroke had sounded for the last time, and somewhere across London a woman who had never truly been dead was learning at last how to live. Chapter 9. The clock that struck 13. We did not, after all, breakfast at Baker Street. As our cab turned into the Marylebone Road, a shivering constable waved us down. Lestrade leaned from the window of a 4-wheeler ahead, his ferret face pale with urgency. Mr. Holmes, thank God, she's escaped. Slipped the cuffs in the black. Maria coshed the driver and vanished into the Chelsea fog not 20 minutes ago. Armed, desperate, and dressed in that scarlet tunic. I've got every man in the division beating the embankment, but... Holmes's eyes blazed. Back to Bromley House, and quickly. She will make for the one place where the stage is still set. We reached Chelsea at a gallop. The morning was now bright and cold, the river glittering like steel. The iron gate stood ajar. The front door yawned open upon darkness. Inside, the house felt different, charged as though the very air waited for a curtain to rise. Holmes bounded up the great staircase, revolver drawn. I followed, pulse hammering. On the first-floor landing, the study door stood wide. From within came the low, rhythmic ticking of the ormolu clock, ticking with a new, deliberate slowness. We entered. Evelyn Bromley stood beneath the plaster rose, once more in the scarlet tunic, the metals gleaming like drops of blood. In her right hand she held the tiny silver spoon on its black silk thread. In her left a Webley service revolver pointed straight at the heart of Violet, our Violet, who sat bound to Sir Reginald's chair, gagged, veiled, tears shining on her cheeks. The clock on the mantel showed 1 minute to noon. "Welcome, Mr. Holmes," said Evelyn calmly. "You are in time for the final performance. At the 12th stroke, my little sister will drink what her lover drank. At the 13th, I shall join her. Vanity of vanities, both Lady Bromleys dead in the same room, the same manner, the perfect cadence." Holmes took 1 slow step forward. "Put the pistol down, madam, you have lost." "Have I?" She laughed, and the scar at her temple flashed white. "The house is surrounded, yes, but by your men, not mine. 1 twitch of my finger and Violet dies. Another and I follow. You cannot prevent both." The clock whirred softly, preparing to strike. Holmes's voice became gentle, almost conversational. "You tampered with the escapement again this morning. I watched you do it from the attic. But you made one small miscalculation. He reached into his pocket and drew out a tiny brass screw no longer than a match. The screw you filed and refiled. I removed it an hour ago while Lestrade searched the embankment. The clock will strike 12, madam, and no more. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across her face. You are lying. Test me. The minute hand touched the hour. The mechanism began its chime. 1, 2, 3. Evelyn's eyes darted to the clock, then back to Holmes. The revolver wavered. 4, 5, 6. Violet struggled against her bonds, eyes wide with terror. 7, 8, 9. Holmes took another step. Listen, he said softly. 10, 11. The hammer fell for the 12th stroke and stopped. A dull, broken click echoed in the silence. The clock gave a tired sigh and died. Evelyn stared at it, transfixed. In that instant of shattered expectation, Holmes moved. His stick flicked the Webley from her hand. It spun across the carpet and came to rest beneath a Ming dragon vase. I sprang forward and cut Violet's bonds with my pocket knife. Evelyn did not resist. She stood like a statue, the silver spoon still dangling from her fingers. It was to have been 13, she whispered. 13 for the years I lay buried in snow. 13 for the months he spent with her while I watched from the attic. 13 for the disciples at the Last Supper, one of whom always betrays. Holmes picked up the fallen revolver. The world is not a stage, madam, however much you wish it, and clocks obey physics, not symbolism. Lestrade and his men burst in at that moment, breathless. They took her without a struggle. As the handcuffs went on for the second time, she looked once at her half-sister. Tell them, Violet, she said almost tenderly. Tell them which of us he truly loved. Violet, pale but composed, met her gaze. He loved neither of us, she answered. He loved only the idea of possessing two lives. You punished him for it. Do not punish me. Evelyn closed her eyes. When the constables led her away, she walked erect, the scarlet tunic bright as a wound against the dark paneling. Later, when the police and the reporters had gone, Holmes and I stood alone in the study. He opened the ormolu clock and gently replaced the missing screw. The hands moved forward. The mechanism gave a small, apologetic chime. 12 strokes only, he murmured. The 13th was always an illusion, an act of will imposed upon metal and springs. Like so much in this case, he turned the great Venetian mirror to the wall. Some reflections are best left unseen. Violet, Lady Bromley no longer, merely Miss Violet St. Aubyn, joined us. She had removed the veil. In the clear daylight, she looked younger, almost fragile. What will happen to her? She asked. Holmes considered. Broadmoor, I imagine, rather than the gallows. The plea of insanity will be irresistible. She will paint, perhaps, portraits of women who were never allowed to exist. He offered Violet his arm. Come, the house belongs to the nation now. The porcelain collection will go to the South Kensington Museum, Sir Reginald's true legacy. Let us leave the dragons to the experts. As we stepped into the hall, old Greaves appeared, hat in hand. If you please, sir, the clock in the attic. It started again, striking 13, slow and steady like a heartbeat. Holmes and I exchanged glances. We mounted the narrow stairs for the last time. In the attic, the traveling clock that had belonged to Captain Ventris lay upon the painter's table. Its face was cracked, the hands bent, yet it ticked with solemn persistence. As we watched, the hammer rose and fell, once, twice, 13 times exactly, then fell silent. Holmes picked it up, wound it gently, and set it to the correct hour. Even broken clocks, he said, sometimes speak the truth. Captain Ventris has had his 13th stroke at last. Let us give him peace. He placed the clock inside the empty portrait frame where Evelyn's last canvas had hung. an oval of bare linen waiting for a face that would never be painted, and closed the attic door behind us. Outside, the sun was fully up, gilding the river and striking fire from the dragon vases visible through the study window. Somewhere a church bell began to ring the hour, 12 clear strokes, no more. The house that had watched itself for 5 long years closed its eyes at last. Chapter 10. The Final Deduction. The inquest was held 3 weeks later in the long, chill room of the Chelsea Vestry Hall. Reporters crowded the benches. The public gallery was packed with veiled ladies and curious idlers who had followed the case in every newspaper from the Times to the Police Gazette. Sherlock Holmes, Dr. John Watson, and Miss Violet St. Aubin occupied the front row. Opposite us in the dock sat Evelyn Rose St. Aubin, straight-backed, pale, the scar at her temple hidden beneath a plain black bonnet. She had refused the scarlet tunic. She wore instead the severe gray dress of a prison hospital. The coroner, a stout man with a voice like a cracked bell, read the medical evidence. Cyanide poisoning, administered by an ingenious overhead method, the details of which caused an audible gasp to ripple through the room. Lestrade gave his testimony with modest pride, laying out the attic apparatus, the silver spoon, the silk thread, the Venetian mirror, and the ormolu clock, now restored to 12 strokes only. When he described the attempted second murder and the prisoner's dramatic recapture, the public gallery broke into spontaneous applause until the usher threatened to clear the court. Holmes was called last. He rose, calm and grave, and in 20 crisp minutes laid the entire chain before the jury. The Swiss avalanche that had not killed, the forged death certificate, the 5 years of silent watching, the bigamous second marriage, the elaborate revenge designed not merely to kill but to destroy the usurper's soul before her body. He spoke without flourish, yet every word struck like a chisel on marble. When he had finished, he turned to the prisoner. "Madam, have you anything to say before the jury retires?" Evelyn rose. For a moment she looked at Violet, long, steadily, almost tenderly. "Only this," she said, and her voice carried to the farthest corner of the hall. "I was Lady Bromley for 7 years. She was Lady Bromley for 6 months. I buried myself alive so that he might live in peace. When I rose from the grave, I found he had given my name, my house, my bed to another. I took back what was mine. If that be crime, then hang me. If it be justice, then set me free." A hush fell. Even the coroner seemed moved. Then the jury retired for only 9 minutes. They returned with the verdict. Every soul in the room had expected willful murder. Yet no one cheered. The prisoner bowed her head, not in defeat but in acknowledgement, and was led away. She did not look back. That same evening we gathered once more in 221B Baker Street. A bright fire crackled. The table was laid with cold roast beef, a Stilton, and a bottle of the Imperial Tokay. Mrs. Hudson had surpassed herself. Violet St. Aubin, free now and legally the widow of Sir Reginald Bromley, sat beside the hearth, the inevitable black veil discarded at last. In the lamplight she looked almost a girl again. Lestrade had come to take a modest glass of whiskey and to receive Holmes's quiet congratulations. "You'll have the credit, Inspector," Holmes said, raising his glass. "The Yard caught the veiled suspect. I merely pointed." Lestrade grinned sheepishly. "And a rare dance she led us, Mr. Holmes. Broadmoor has her now. They say she paints portraits of women in mourning. Good ones, too. The doctors hang them in the ward." When he had gone, Violet turned to Holmes. "Tell me one thing more. You knew from the very first night, did you not? When I came veiled and trembling to this room, how did you know I was not Evelyn?" Holmes filled her glass with Tokay. "Because, my dear lady, you knocked 3 times, measured, deliberate, the knock of a woman counting her courage. Evelyn would have knocked once imperiously or not at all. And when you spoke of your husband, you said, I left him alive at 11:45. A murderess would have said, I left him at 11:45, omitting the word that proved life still remained. Small things, but to me they shouted innocence. He leaned back, the firelight playing on his hawk-like features. After that, it was only a matter of deciding which twin had survived the avalanche and which had married bigamously. The limp settled it. Evelyn favored the right leg after the alpine injury, you the left from a childhood fall. The rest, the mirror, the clock, the 13th stroke, was mere confirmation. I set down my glass. And the moral of this grim little farce? Holmes gazed into the flames. That vanity is the most dangerous poison of all. Sir Reginald's vanity persuaded him he could possess 2 lives without paying for either. Evelyn's vanity persuaded her she could orchestrate perfect revenge and remain untouched by justice. Even the clock's 13th stroke was vanity, an attempt to impose human meaning upon indifferent machinery. He turned to Violet with rare gentleness. And your vanity, dear lady, your only sin, was to love a man who was never worthy of you. Let that be buried with him. Violet raised her glass. To truth, then, she said quietly, however late it comes. We drank. Outside, a thin November rain had begun to fall, washing the grime from the Baker Street windows. Somewhere across London, in the high-walled garden of Broadmoor, a woman in grey painted portraits no one would ever sign, while in Chelsea a silent house full of dragons waited for the nation's curators. Holmes lit his pipe and stretched his long legs toward the blaze. And now, Watson, if you have your notebook, I believe there is space in your annals for one more tale. You may call it The Veiled Suspect, or The Woman Who Knocked Thrice, or any title that catches the public fancy. Only remember to remind your readers that in every tangled skein, there is one thread which, if resolutely followed, leads to the light. I took up my pen, and for a little while the only sounds were the crackle of the fire, the soft scratch of the nib, and the distant rumble of a hansom cab taking some late traveler home through the cleansing rain. Another case was closed. The clock on our own mantel struck the hour, 12 clear notes, no more, no less, and settled back into the comfortable rhythm of ordinary time. Yet sometimes, in the quiet watches of the night, I fancy I still hear it, a faint, far-off echo, patient and terrible, waiting for the moment when it will strike 13 once again. But that, as Sherlock Holmes would say, is another story.